In this video, we will look at lists in Python. Now, when we ask for the simple question that what are lists? Lists are nothing but the ordered sequence of numbers or elements, and lists are the mostly used data type in Python. Now, in this video, we will also look at how to create a list, what would be the indexing and the slicing of a list, the inbuilt methods, what is meant by nesting of lists, and the most important of them all, the list comprehension. So jump into a Jupyter notebook and look at these concepts. Okay, I'm opening a new notebook and let's begin our discussion now. The first question, how do we actually create a list? Creating a list is very simple. So let's say if I want to create the list called my list, all I have to do here is give opening and closing parentheses, that is square brackets. You would see that there are similarities in certain things with which we have already discussed with in the previous data types. As we go along, you would be able to link those concepts to the concepts that we are going to discuss in lists. So let's say now I want to create a list of 3 elements. So let's give the same name, that is my list, and I'm going to simply overwrite it with, let's say I'm going to give the elements as AA, BB and CC. So this is a list containing 3 elements. Now what's the most important thing or the most interesting piece of information that you would find is this doesn't have to be elements of same data type. So here, like in line 2, we have actually gotten 3 elements of the string data type. Okay, but it's not necessary that all the elements of a list should be of the same data type. So let's create this particular list with different data types. So let's say the first element that I want is a number. Let's go for the number 2. Now second element is a string, and the third element is a floating point. So let's give it some random number 7.65. Okay, so if we run this, Python will not complain. So in a list you can actually put in multiple data types and Python is going to accept it. Okay, now there could be a situation wherein you might think that can we have list inside a list? Okay, that is, instead of having this element AA, can we actually have another list inside it? And the answer to that question is yes. Then that is exactly what we mean when we say the term nested lists. So let's see an example of a nested list. So let's give the same variable name my list, and this time let's go with AA is my first element. The second element that I'm going to keep is a list itself, and it's a list of numbers. Let's take 1, 2 and 3. So this is my second element. Now the third is another list of, let's say, strings. So it is D, E and F. So you can see whenever we write list of lists, you will always see this particular thing to have double square brackets. Okay, so this is one element. It itself is a list, and this is inside another list. So if we run this thing, we actually have this list created, and this is the example of a nested list. Now, creating the list is what we have discussed now. But let's say What if I want the element AA from this list? I don't want the other elements. I just want this. I want to just grab the element AA from inside this. So that we can do. That is how we can access elements, is by simply saying the indexing method that we saw in the previous lessons. So here, because AA is the first element, so if I simply say my list of 0, and if I run this, I get my element AA. Okay. Now, similarly, if I want to grab the last element, so in our case, the last element is this list DEF, and if I want to grab it, so we can simply go for the negative numbers. So -1 indicates the last element. So negative indexing will help you grab the numbers or the elements whenever the number of elements is huge, or you can also apply it for smaller lists as well. So in our case, we can simply say -1 and it is going to give us this element, that is it's a list DEF. Okay, now let's make it a little more interesting. Now let's say I want the element 2. Okay, I want to grab this element. Now if we look at this, we have to do it in, you can do it in two parts in the beginning, but once you understand it, it becomes very simple. So this element 2 is part of the second element inside this list. And by the notation, we know second element, that means we have to write the number 1, and it is going to give us 1, 2, 3. Okay, but I didn't want 1, 2, 3, I just want the element 2. Okay, so what we do here is you take this thing and inside this again you pass in the number. So once we write 1, we are getting this list. Now this list also has an indexing of its own. So the number 2 is again in the index 1. So if we run this, we are going to get our element 2. So ideally what happens is whenever you have a list inside the list, first check which position it is in, and once you grab that position, then check again inside the list where the particular element is in. So here 2 is in the second position, that is according to Python it is in index 1. Okay, so we can simply write my list of 1 1 and we can grab the element 2. Now, what happens if we give a decimal number? So let's say if I simply say 1.5, for example, and we run this, we get the similar error that we got last time. That is when we applied this on strings, even then we had this same kind of problem where we had a type error where Python is telling us that the indices must be an integer. And we cannot have float values because float values Python will not understand in this case. Okay, now coming to the next part, that are slicing. So slicing means you are capturing a small portion of your entire data. So for example, when I say my list and if I run this, okay, we get this is the list that we have. And let's say out of this entire list, I just want to capture the first two elements. Now that I have highlighted, I only need these two elements and nothing else. So now we can apply the slicing concept, and slicing works with the a simple symbol of colon. Okay, now since we need the first two elements, all I have to do is I have to write 0 is to 2. So 0 starts for the first element and is to 2 means it is the number that you mentioned here, it will not consider that number for taking the elements. What I mean by that is if I run this, you can see it is only captured 0 and 1. So 0 and 1, that is what we wanted. Okay, and this number 2 is ignored. So this element is not captured anymore. So you have to take note of that point, that whenever you're actually using slicing method, after the is to symbol, just add +1 to whichever element you wanted. Okay, so you wanted the element still the first element, so +1. So you have to write till the second element. Then what will happen is Python will capture these two. That is what the output that we wanted. Okay, now let's create another list. So I'll simply say my list 2, and inside this, let's say I'm giving the numbers from 1 to 8. Okay, so this is my list. Now out of this list, if by using slicing method, if I want to capture the entire list, okay, so using slicing method, the way we capture it is, I need all the elements, so I have to start from 0, and how many elements? So it is starting with 0 and it goes all the way till 7. So all I have to write is, I have to write here 8. So we'll get all our elements from 1 to 8. Now, what happens if I want a certain slice of the data but not from the beginning? So let's say I want to capture the numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This piece. Okay. So if we want to capture this piece, then what would happen is, here you have to actually grab this particular number. So since we are saying we want to grab the number from 2, so instead of 0 we have to mention 1. Okay. And you can either count it out or you can check for yourself. Okay, so here if you want you can mention it as 1 is to 6, and you get the number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, now the next piece of information that we'll look at is what happens if you want to change the elements. In strings we saw that we won't be able to change the elements. Strings were immutable. But when it comes to lists are mutable objects. That is, we can change the elements, and the the said element is going to get override written. Okay, so let's start off with by list 2, and let's say I want to change this number 2 to number 10. So number 2 is in the position of 1. So index 1. So if I write my list 2 of 1, I get the element 2. But now I wanted to overwrite it this number 10. So if I write equals 10, and now if we look at my list 2, then here you would see that the number has been overwritten. Okay. Similarly, let's say if I want to overwrite or change multiple numbers, not just one. So this method was used when we wanted to change just one number. But let's say I wanted to now change the numbers from the index 1 all the way till index 3. Okay. So first let's actually run that and see for ourselves which number are we talking about. So 1 is to 4 will give me these numbers that I'm looking for. So index 1, 2 and 3. Now let's say I want to change these numbers to 2, 2 and 2. What you have to make sure is, while you're typing this out, the number of elements that you have mentioned here, that should match with the number of elements when you're passing it as a list. Okay, you cannot have 1 is to 4 and you can and give 4 or 5 numbers here. That will not work. Okay, so here because I have selected 3 elements, that is 10, 3 and 4, I have passing only 3 numbers. So when we do this, and now if we check my list 2, you see that all these three numbers have been changed. So this is how you can change multiple elements at